There is a piece of footage on a government hard drive somewhere that most people working in federal land management have never seen and never will. It was captured by a fixed thermal camera mounted on a 10-foot steel pole inside a restricted perimeter in the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee, as part of a classified program that had been running for nearly 20 years. A program built around the premise that DOGMAN were present in that corridor in documented numbers and required active management. The camera was part of an asset denial infrastructure, the kind of equipment that gets installed when a federal agency needs to know what is moving through a specific corridor of wilderness at night and cannot afford to have that information become public record. The footage shows two figures standing at the edge of a tree line, upright, unmoving, watching a station that had been set up specifically for them. What makes the footage unusual is not the creatures themselves. By the time this camera recorded them, they had been visiting this station for close to 4 years. What makes it unusual is what happens at the end of the clip. One of the figures turns its head, not toward the station, not toward the tree line, but toward the camera pole. Turns, looks directly at the lens from roughly 60 yards, holds that position for several seconds, and then both figures move back into the forest at the same moment. Together, without any audible signal between them that the thermal audio captured. The man who reviewed that footage in real time was not a wildlife researcher. He was not a park ranger or a DNR officer or a graduate student collecting data for a dissertation. He was a private military contractor with a background in perimeter security and wilderness operations, sitting in a mobile operations center about 300 yards from that camera pole. And when he watched the taller of those two figures look directly at the lens, he told me something shifted in him that has never fully shifted back. He had been working that program for 3 years. He had been told the creatures were territorial animals responding to a food stimulus. He understood his job as maintaining the stations, securing the perimeter, and keeping the program invisible to the public. What he had not been told, what he figured out that night watching the footage replay on his monitor, was that the creatures understood the cameras. The distinction matters. An animal that stumbles across a camera and learns over time to avoid it is a different order of problem than what Dex was looking at. These animals had not learned to avoid the cameras. They understood what cameras were. The way you understand a device whose function you have reasoned out. And they were engaging with them on purpose. They understood them the way you understand a device whose function you have reasoned out. The dogman looking into that lens was not looking at a strange object. It was looking at the person on the other side. The man we are calling Dex has been carrying that knowledge for close to 20 years. He is talking about it now because some of the people who ran that program are dead. Because the paperwork he held on to is specific enough to be verified, and because after 2 decades of silence he has concluded that the public understanding of what these creatures are is incomplete in ways that matter. What follows is what he told us. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from. What Dex shared takes some time to lay out properly, and you are going to want to stay for all of it. His name is not really Dex. He asked that we not use his real name, and given the nature of the work he did and the specific contractual language around the program he was part of, that request is not negotiable. The program itself was not classified in the formal intelligence community sense of the word. It did not carry a compartmented clearance designation. But the paperwork he signed during onboarding contained non-disclosure provisions tied to Federal Land Management Authority under Title 36 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and the penalties for violation were described in language specific enough that Dex spent several months consulting with an attorney before agreeing to talk to us. The county is real. The forest is real. The paperwork is real. Only the name has been changed, and given what happened to at least 2 other people who worked this program and tried to speak about it afterward, the protection is warranted. Dex grew up in eastern Tennessee in a stretch of Carter County that sits along the Watauga River between the town of Elizabethton and the edge of the National Forest. His father worked for Tennessee Valley Authority as an electrician for over 30 years, maintaining transmission infrastructure across the mountain counties. His grandfather had worked for one of the timber operations that stripped these ridges in the 1930s before the federal purchase program assembled most of the high country into what eventually became the Cherokee National Forest. Dex grew up knowing these mountains the way people know country they were handed at birth rather than country they chose. He knew which creek drainages held trout in summer and which ones dried to a trickle by August. He knew the logging road network the way most people know their own neighborhood, every switchback and washed-out section and unmarked turnoff. He spent his teenage years hunting whitetail and turkey with his father on the same ridges his grandfather had logged, and he developed the kind of terrain intuition that only comes from spending the better part of 2 decades in one specific piece of ground across every season and every condition it can produce. He enlisted in the Army at 18, infantry, and spent 8 years including 2 overseas deployments before separating as a staff sergeant. After the service, he drifted through a few years of residential construction and a stint doing security work for a coal company in Kentucky, before a former unit colleague connected him with a private contracting firm that specialized in what the industry calls sensitive site security. The work was for federal clients, mostly land management agencies, and a handful of defense-adjacent programs that required cleared personnel with wilderness operations backgrounds. Dex had the background. He had the clearance from his service years. He had the specific geographic knowledge of the southern Appalachians that the firm needed for the eastern Tennessee contract. He was hired in the late 90s, went through the firm's onboarding process, and was assigned to what the internal documentation called the Cherokee Asset Management Program. That name told him almost nothing, which was intentional. The onboarding briefing described the program as a long-term wildlife behavior study being conducted on behalf of a federal agency that Dex was not told the name of. The study involved maintaining a series of feeding stations at specific locations within the national forest. The stations were serviced on a regular schedule. Contractor personnel were responsible for resupplying the stations, maintaining the camera and sensor infrastructure, securing the perimeter against unauthorized entry, and logging all observations in a standardized format that was transmitted to a program coordinator Dex knew only by a first name. He was told the study animals were large native predators whose behavioral patterns were being documented for purposes of habitat management. He was told the animals were potentially dangerous and that his job did not involve direct observation of the animals. He was told not to discuss the program with anyone outside the contractor team. He signed the paperwork and went to work. For the first 6 months, the work was exactly what it sounded like. Dex drove Forest Service roads into the Cherokee's interior, serviced the stations, which held large quantities of processed meat, protein, and grain, arranged in specific configurations he was given as a diagram on a laminated card, checked the camera systems, logged his observations, and returned to the mobile operations center. He worked with a team of 3 other contractors. Their team lead was a man he came to know as Orrin, a former Army Ranger from East Texas who was laconic in the way that men who have been in serious situations sometimes get, speaking precisely and without waste, and laughing only rarely when something actually struck him as funny. Orrin had been with the program for 2 years before Dex joined. He knew the terrain and the protocols, and he ran a tight team. When Dex asked him what specifically they were studying, Orrin told him to read the log forms carefully and draw his own conclusions. Dex read the log forms carefully. The stations were positioned at 9 locations across a roughly 18-mile corridor running northeast along the Tennessee-North Carolina border, staying within the Cherokee National Forest boundary but in the portions of the forest that saw minimal public use. The corridor roughly paralleled the Appalachian Trail at a distance of 4 to 8 miles to the west, staying in the drainages and hollows between the high ridge system that the trail follows and the lower country to the southwest. This is some of the most remote terrain in the Eastern National Forest System. The watershed here drains into tributaries of the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers through creek systems that cut deep into the sandstone and granite of the unglaciated Appalachian Plateau. The hollows are dark and steep and choked with rhododendron and mountain laurel in the draws, with old-growth hemlock along the creek banks and mixed hardwood on the ridges above. The canopy is dense enough that satellite imagery of these areas shows almost nothing beneath it. You can walk through for days without seeing another person. The log forms required him to document visitation at each station, time, evidence of consumption, any physical sign left behind including tracks, scat, or hair, and to note any direct observation of the study animals. The form included a species designation field that contained a single pre-printed entry. It read, "Large unclassified canid bipedal." That was the first indication that what Dex was being asked to do was not entirely standard wildlife management work. In the broader research community, what this entry described would be called a DOGMAN. But inside the program, that word did not appear anywhere in the official documentation Dex was given. He asked Oren about the designation. Oren told him that the program had its own classification system independent of state and federal wildlife taxonomies. He told Dex not to overthink it. He told him to use the forms as written. Dex used the forms as written, and over the following months he began to build a picture of what was using the stations. The stations were being visited consistently. Not occasionally, not seasonally, but on a predictable schedule that showed up in the log data with a regularity that told Dex the animals had incorporated the stations into their routine. Station 7, in a hollow above a small tributary of Stony Creek in Carter County, was visited every 3 to 4 days without exception across the first 5 months of Dex's assignment. Station 3, on a ridge shelf above the Laurel Fork drainage, was visited less frequently but always showed evidence of multiple individuals. The tracks at Station 3 were the first thing that stopped Dex cold. He had grown up tracking deer and bear and hog in these mountains. He had been trained by the Army in tracking methodology as part of combat reconnaissance. He knew what a bear track looked like, knew how weight distribution and stride pattern changed with posture, knew the difference between a print made by an animal moving on all fours and one made by an animal that regularly moves upright. The tracks at Station 3 were not bear tracks. They were made by something moving bipedally on 2 feet, with a stride pattern that fell between a human's and something wider gaited and heavier. The individual footprint was elongated with 5 toe marks set wide and forward, and the heel strike was deep in a way that indicated significant upper body weight. An animal with a large chest and shoulders transferring load downward through a vertical spine. He measured one print at just over 15 inches in length and about 8 inches across at the widest point. He photographed it, logged it on the form, and said nothing to Oren that evening beyond what the form required. Every description he had ever read of a DOGMAN track, and he had not read many because he had not been looking for them, matched what he was measuring in that hollow above the Laurel Fork drainage. He understood now what the program was studying. But he was now paying close attention. It was a cool night in early October, about 8 months into his assignment, when Dex first saw one of the study animals. Not at a station. He was on a perimeter walk, checking the sensor line that ran along the western edge of the corridor near Station 4, carrying a handheld thermal unit the firm had issued for night observation. The thermal showed the creek drainage below him, the cold water running bright and the surrounding vegetation darker. He was moving slowly, the way you move in mountain terrain at night when you are trying not to roll an ankle, when the thermal image showed him something standing in the creek bed about 70 yards downslope. He stopped. He raised the unit and steadied it. The image showed 2 heat signatures, one larger, one smaller, but still substantial, both upright, both oriented toward the creek bank with their backs to him. He watched them for close to 3 minutes, motionless, barely breathing. They did not move. They stood in the creek, and the smaller one appeared to be doing something at the bank. He could see movement of the arms, a deliberate and repeated motion that he described as methodical. Then the larger one turned and looked up the slope toward where Dex was standing. He could not see eyes through the thermal unit. It did not produce that kind of resolution at that range. But the orientation of the head was unmistakable. It was looking directly at him. Dex did not move. The larger figure held its position for what he estimated as 15 to 20 seconds, head-oriented uphill toward his position. Then it made a sound. Not loud, not a howl or a bark or anything dramatic. A low structured vocalization, short, 2 distinct tonal components with a falling inflection at the end. The smaller figure stopped its work at the bank immediately. Both figures moved into the forest on the far side of the creek without hurry, disappearing into the rhododendron in seconds. Dex stood on the slope for a long time after that, thermal unit pointed at empty forest. He logged the observation when he got back to the operations center. Time of observation, duration, number of individuals, general description, behavior at time of observation. He noted the vocalization in the comments field and described it as structured, 2-component, appeared to function as a warning or departure signal. He submitted the log. Nobody from the program coordinator level contacted him about it. The log went into the system and the program continued. He did not log everything he thought about that encounter. He did not log the fact that the moment before the larger figure vocalized, before the departure, it had spent 15 seconds looking up a dark slope at a man standing motionless in the trees. He did not log the question that settled into the back of his mind, and did not leave. How had it known he was there? The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres running in a discontinuous band along the Tennessee-North Carolina border from the Georgia state line, north to the Virginia border. The stretch that Dex worked occupies the northern portion of the forest, the section that wraps around the upper Watauga and Nolichucky drainages in Carter, Johnson, and Unicoi counties. The terrain here is serious mountain country. The Unaka mountain range reaches over 5,000 feet at its highest points. The valleys are narrow and steep-sided, and the forest that fills them has been largely undisturbed since the TVA land acquisitions of the 1930s and 40s that created the Watauga Lake Reservoir to the north and cleared out most of the small farming operations that had occupied these hollows for generations. The families that had farmed and logged the Cherokee country for 150 years were bought out or flooded out depending on which valley they occupied. And what remained behind was the forest coming back over cleared fields and skid roads, and the collapsed stone foundations of homesteads that no one was left to remember. That history matters for understanding what Dex's program was actually operating inside of. These mountains have a deep human history, and before that, a much deeper Cherokee history. The Cherokee called this portion of their homeland the Overhill Country, the settlements west of the Unaka Crest closer to the Tennessee Valley. And the specific terrain that the Contractor program occupied was land the Cherokee had used for generations as hunting ground, and in the deeper hollows as places associated with what their oral traditions described as beings that inhabited the mountain country alongside them. The Keklikudle, translated roughly as the hairy man, appears in documented Cherokee oral tradition going back to the earliest recorded accounts from the late 18th century. These accounts were collected by ethnographers working with Cherokee communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and are held in the archives of the Bureau of American Ethnology and the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina. The descriptions are consistent and specific. A large being, primarily nocturnal, inhabiting the remote drainages of the southern Appalachian high country. Standing upright like a person but built differently, heavier and taller with the head of an animal, not aggressive toward people who did not intrude into its spaces. Territorial in the way that a landowner is territorial, maintaining clear expectations about what was permitted and what was not. The Cherokee relationship with the Kexle-Kudle was not one of fear so much as protocol. There were specific behaviors: where to camp, when to travel through certain drainages, what to leave and what to take. That maintained the coexistence. Dex learned about this history on his own time, not through the program. He read what he could find because he was trying to understand what the log forms were asking him to document, and the scientific literature on large unknown Appalachian predators was not helpful. What was helpful was the ethnographic record because the behavioral profile in the Cherokee documentation matched what he was observing at the stations closely enough to be unsettling. He understood then that the DOGMAN, that word was his, not the program's, was not a recent phenomenon in these mountains. The predictable visitation schedule, the apparent awareness of human presence without confrontation, the structured vocalizations that his log forms recorded as occurring consistently in the 2 to 4 in the morning window. The evidence of multiple individuals operating in coordination, all of it was in the ethnographic record under a different name, but with the same characteristics. He asked Orrin one evening back at the operations center after a station service run whether anyone in the program had looked into the historical Cherokee documentation on this. Orrin was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when a question was more interesting than he wanted to let on. Then he said the program coordinator had flagged the ethnographic material in the initial program design documents. He said it was in the background file that Dex had not been given access to. Dex asked what else was in the background file. Orrin said that was probably enough of that conversation for tonight. It was 2 years into his assignment before Dex understood what the program was actually doing. Or rather, 2 years before the evidence he had been accumulating resolved into a conclusion he could not argue his way out of. He had been given a protocol update. New feeding configurations at 3 of the stations, higher protein content, increased frequency of resupply at Station 7 and Station 3. The new configurations came with a laminated update card like the original. But this one had a notation in the bottom corner that the original had not. It read Stage 3 with a colon and a date. The date was the current month. Dex looked at that notation and understood immediately that what it implied was the existence of Stage 1 and Stage 2. Which meant that what the program had been doing for the 4 years preceding his involvement was the same thing it was still doing, moving through a defined sequence toward a defined outcome. He did not ask Orrin about it that night. He had learned by then that Orrin answered questions carefully, which meant that a good question asked at the wrong moment got a careful non-answer that closed the door on further inquiry. Dex was better served by observing, so he observed. What Stage 3 meant, as best Dex could reconstruct from the evidence, was an intensification of the habituation protocol. The feeding stations had been operating long enough that the animals' visitation was conditioned and reliable. Stage 3 appeared to involve increasing the reward density, more food, more frequently at specific stations, while also changing the time window of the resupply. Instead of servicing the stations during daytime hours when the animals were inactive, Dex and his team were now instructed to service 3 of the stations during the early evening window, between 6 and 8 p.m., before full dark. The implication of that timing change was not subtle. The program was deliberately increasing the probability that contractor personnel would be present at the stations during hours when the animals were becoming active. Not to observe them from a safe distance, to be present in the same space during the transition period between the animals' inactive and active phases. He thought about that for several days before he mentioned it to anyone. When he mentioned it to Orrin obliquely, describing it as an interesting change in the protocol without stating the conclusion directly, Orrin looked at him for a moment with an expression that Dex described as the look of a man who already knows the answer you have just worked out and is deciding whether to confirm it. Then Orrin said the program was entering a contact phase. He said it carefully, as though contact was a term of art with a specific technical meaning. He said Dex should continue following the protocol and logging his observations. He said this was normal progression. Normal progression. Dex serviced Station 7 at 6:45 on a Thursday evening in late October, about 2.5 years into his assignment. He set the new configuration, checked the camera housing, replaced the sensor battery, logged the service time. He was packing his equipment when he heard something on the slope above the station. Not the sound of approach, the sound of presence. A stillness in the tree line that had a quality to it. A weight in the listening silence that told him something was up there already. He did not look immediately. He had developed a specific protocol for these moments over 2 years of operating in this terrain. A set of behaviors built on careful observation of how the animals responded to human movement. Quick direct eye contact at close range tended to function as a threat cue. Slow peripheral attention, continuing to move through a routine while allowing the peripheral field to gather information, produced different behavior. He finished packing his equipment with deliberate calm. Then he walked to his truck, opened the door, and looked up at the slope. Something was standing at the tree line about 50 feet above the station. The last light of evening was behind the ridge, just enough gray in the sky to separate the silhouette from the dark timber behind it. It was upright, tall. Dex estimated 8 feet or close to it based on how it compared to the hemlock trunks at the edge of the clearing. The shoulders were wide, the arms long, the head set forward on the neck in the characteristic posture he recognized from the thermal imaging. It was not moving. It was watching the station, and then it was watching him, and then it turned its head away. A deliberate, unhurried movement, the way you turn your head to look at something else when you have finished noting what you needed to note about what you were looking at before. He got in the truck. He drove out. He called Oren on the radio and reported the observation. Oren's response was 3 words. He said, "Log it normally." If you have spent time in the Cherokee National Forest or in the mountain country along the Carter and Johnson County line in eastern Tennessee, particularly in the hollows above the Watauga River drainage between Elizabethton and Hampton, you have been in the terrain this story comes out of. Let us know in the comments if you have had anything unusual happen in those mountains. Based on what Dex shared with us, that corridor has been active for a long time, and not all of it is in any official record. The encounter at Station 7 would have been remarkable on its own. What happened over the following 8 months is what made Dex understand that the program he was working was not a wildlife study. It was a relationship management protocol. And the entity being managed was not behaving like a study animal. It was behaving like a party to an agreement. After the evening observation at Station 7, the pattern changed. Not in ways that the log forms would necessarily capture, not in terms that the program coordinator would have flagged as anomalous. But Dex noticed the animal he had observed. He was increasingly confident it was the same individual based on the track measurements and the gait pattern visible on the station cameras. Was now present at the station before the service team arrived, consistently when Dex's vehicle was part of the service rotation. When a different contractor ran the Station 7 route, the arrival pattern was different. The animal arrived after resupply during the nighttime hours the way it had for the first 2 years of Dex's assignment. But when Dex ran the Station 7 route across a 3-month observation window he tracked carefully in his personal notes rather than the program log, the animal was there within the approach window 70% of the time. The animal was tracking his schedule, not the station's schedule. His schedule. He had a rotation, a predictable pattern of which days he serviced which stations. The animal had learned it. He sat with that conclusion for a long time before he told anyone. He sat with it because accepting it meant accepting that the creature's cognitive model of its environment included not just the station as a food source, but the specific human associated with the station. It had individuated him. Of all the contractor personnel who serviced that station over the years, this animal had identified Dex as a specific individual with a specific pattern, and it had incorporated that pattern into its own movement behavior. That is not territorial instinct. That is not conditioning in the simple stimulus response sense that the program's language around food habituation implied. That is something closer to what a person does when they learn a neighbor's routine. This is the part where Dex told me he stopped sleeping well. End of part 1. He told Oren what he had found in his personal tracking data on a Monday morning in late January, about 2.5 years into his assignment. He laid it out the way he had been trained to present field intelligence, specific dates, specific observations, the methodology he had used to eliminate alternative explanations. He showed Oren the personal log, the numbers, the 3-month window. He said, "The animal at Station 7 knows my rotation." Oren listened without interrupting. When Dex finished, Oren was quiet for long enough that it started to feel like a different kind of silence than the usual Oren quiet. Then he said he was going to make a call. He went outside. He was out there for about 20 minutes. When he came back in, he poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down, and told Dex 2 things. The first thing he said was that what Dex had documented was consistent with observations from earlier program phases, and that the program coordinator was aware of the behavior pattern. The second thing he said was that Dex was being moved off the Station 7 rotation effective immediately. Dex asked why. Oren said it was a protocol decision from the coordinator level and that it was not open for discussion. He said Dex would take over Station 2 and Station 5 going forward. Someone else would handle 7. He said this in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that closed conversations. Dex took Stations 2 and 5, but he kept the personal log. What he had not told Oren, and did not tell him because by then he understood that Oren reported to someone who made decisions that Oren was not always given the reasons for, was what he had found on Station 7's camera the previous week. He had downloaded the footage during the service run as part of his normal routine, copied it to his personal drive before uploading the official version to the program server. The footage from 11 days prior showed the station at night, empty, everything as it should be. Then about 3 hours after his service visit that day, the animal arrived. It moved through the station in its normal pattern, taking food from the configuration, circling the perimeter, pausing at the camera mount in a way it had not done before. Pausing and looking at the camera for a long time. And then it did something Dex had never documented before and had not seen in any of the other station camera footage in the program archive he had access to. It reached out and touched the camera housing. Not struck it, not damaged it. Touched it with what the camera showed clearly as a hand. Long-fingered, dark-furred, the thumb set lower and wider than a human thumb. And held the contact for several seconds before withdrawing and moving off into the trees. He had watched that footage 6 times before copying it to his personal drive. He was still not entirely sure what it meant, but he understood it as a data point that the program coordinator finding out he had kept it would create a problem, so he kept it to himself. The reassignment to Stations 2 and 5 lasted 3 months. Then the program entered what the new laminated card described as Stage 3, Phase 2, and Dex found himself back on a station he had not expected to see again. Not Station 7, a new station, Station 10, which was being established in a hollow about 4 miles northeast of 7, in a drainage running off Pond Mountain above the Watauga River. Station 10 was new, which meant the animals at that location had not been through the full habituation sequence. The protocol at a new station was the early phases, standard configuration, daytime servicing only, no evening window. Baseline documentation. He ran Station 10 for several weeks without incident, which at this point in his assignment meant without seeing anything. The stations in early phase showed evidence of visitation but rarely produced direct observation. He documented tracks, scat, consumption patterns, and moved on. It was routine work, and the routine settled him somewhat after the unease of the Station 7 situation. Then in mid-spring he arrived at Station 10 on a Tuesday afternoon to find something he had not left there. On the flat rock that served as the station base, set carefully beside the food configuration, was a deer leg. Not the remnant of something the animals had fed on and left behind. There were no gnaw marks, no blood, no fur torn loose. The leg had been cleaned. The joint was cut, not chewed or broken, in a way that Dex described as deliberate. Set down, not dropped. Placed with the hoof end oriented toward the forest and the cut end toward the station center, the way you might set down a tool when you are finished using it. He photographed it. He logged it. He submitted it in his standard report. The note he included in the comments field was brief. Possible food cache, or reciprocal deposit near station. Unknown behavior pattern. Recommend coordinator review. The coordinator did not respond to that report. Dex did not follow up. 2 weeks later, he found a second deer leg at the same station, placed identically. Same orientation, same condition. Cleaned, the joint cut cleanly. No sign of consumption. Over the following 2 months, he found similar deposits at Station 10 on 4 more occasions. Always a single piece, always cleaned and placed with what appeared to be intention rather than abandonment. He documented everyone. On his last visit before a scheduled equipment maintenance rotation took him off the station for a week, he crouched down and examined the placement carefully before logging it. The cut on the joint was not a tool cut. It was not a knife edge, but it was also not the work of a jaw crushing through bone. The bone was severed cleanly, the way a joint separates when you know the anatomy, when you understand where the socket is and how to apply force to disarticulate it cleanly rather than breaking through the shaft. An experienced butcher knows that cut. A hunter who has processed many deer knows it. Whatever was leaving these deposits at Station 10 understood the joint structure of a deer's leg. Dex wrote this in his personal log and not on the program form because by then he had a clear sense of which observations the program wanted and which ones fell outside what the log form was designed to capture. The form was built to document stimulus-response behavior. Food in, animal arrives, food consumed, animal departs. What was happening at Station 10 was not that. What was happening at Station 10 looked like an exchange. This is the second time I want to stop and ask you to think about what that means. The program had been running feeding stations in this corridor for the better part of a decade by this point. The stated purpose was habituation, conditioning the animals to accept human infrastructure in their territory. But the behavior at Station 10 suggests that the animals had their own understanding of what was happening at these stations, and their understanding was not simply that food appeared and they ate it. Their understanding appears to have included something like reciprocity. You provide food at this location. We provide food at this location. We are exchanging. That is not a thing any behavioral ecologist would predict from a food habituation study. That is a cognitive framework for transaction that implies a social intelligence operating at a level that the program's language. Large, unclassified canid, bipedal, territorial range indicators, habituation phase, was not equipped to describe. The night everything resolved into clarity for Dex came about 3 months after the Station 10 deposits began, in late summer, the second week of August. It was hot, the way it gets in the Tennessee mountains in August when the humidity off the valley floors climbs the ridges and the forest holds it in the canopy and the air in the hollows sits thick and still after dark. Dex was running a perimeter check along the eastern edge of the corridor, the section that skirted the backside of Pond Mountain above the Watauga drainage. He had the thermal unit. He was moving slowly the way he always moved on night perimeter work. He heard a vocalization from below him, not at a station, in open terrain, in the hollow below the ridgeline, from something he estimated at 200 to 300 yards. The vocalization was long, Not the short two-component signal he had heard at the creek 3 years earlier, but an extended sequence, multi-component, with a rising structure and a series of tonal shifts that Dex described as patterned in a way that implied more information than a simple warning or departure signal. He stopped and listened. The vocalization ended. Then from a different direction, maybe a quarter mile to his northeast, a response. Different pitch, shorter, two components and then a rising third. Then silence. He stood on the ridgeline and listened for close to 20 minutes. Nothing further. Whatever exchange had occurred was finished. He was walking back toward his vehicle, following the ridge trail in darkness with only the thermal unit for orientation, when he noticed the camera he was passing. Station 8, which sat at the ridgeline junction. He had serviced it 3 days earlier. He checked the camera housing as a matter of habit. Loose housing was the most common equipment issue in this terrain. Rain and temperature swings worked the fasteners, and found the housing had been adjusted. The camera angle had been changed. It had been pointing northeast down the hollow when he last checked it. It was now pointing directly along the ridgeline trail, directly toward the approach path he used when he came in from the vehicle pull-off to the west. He stood there looking at the camera mount for a long time. That camera was on a 10-foot steel pole. The adjustment required reaching the mounting bracket at the top. Dex was 6 feet tall and could not reach that bracket without a ladder or something to stand on. The bracket had been adjusted from height. He drove back to the operations center. He reviewed the camera footage from the past 3 days. He found the moment. 2 nights earlier, at 1:20 in the morning, a single figure approached the camera pole from below the ridgeline. The thermal image was grainy at that range, but legible enough. The figure was upright. It was large. Dex estimated the height at 8 feet or above based on how the top of the head compared to the pole at its base. It approached the pole, reached up to the mounting bracket, made a specific adjustment with both hands over about 30 seconds, and then withdrew back down the slope. The camera captured this from its original angle, which meant the figure had first positioned itself where the existing camera angle would document the adjustment, and then made the adjustment that redirected the camera. It had understood the camera's field of view. It knew what angle the camera was currently capturing, and it chose a specific new angle, the approach path that Dex used, and made the adjustment deliberately. Dex sat in front of that monitor for a long time. He had been in this program for almost 3 years. He had watched the log forms, understood the habituation language, accepted the framework of a wildlife study with unusual subjects. He had told himself, with a degree of professional detachment that his contractor training reinforced, that his job was to document and maintain, not to draw conclusions above his pay grade. But sitting there watching a thermal image of something 8 feet tall adjusting a government camera to watch his approach path, the professional detachment was no longer available to him. He called Oren, not on the program radio, on his personal phone. He said, "I am looking at footage of a study animal adjusting one of our cameras to cover my approach route." Oren said nothing for several seconds, then he said, "I'm aware of similar events at other stations in the northern section." He said it the way he said things when he had known something for a while and had been waiting to see if Dex would get there on his own. Dex asked why nobody had briefed the team. Oren said there had been a coordinator decision to let the team develop their own observational baseline before introducing the documented pattern from previous program phases. Dex asked how many previous program phases there had been. Oren said there were program records going back about 18 years. Dex asked what the full documented pattern looked like. Oren said he was going to send Dex a file in the morning. The file contained summarized documentation from what the program called phase analysis reports, which were compiled assessments of animal behavior across each phase of the habituation sequence. The reports covered 3 generations of contractor teams at the same stations going back to the late 1980s. The behavior patterns Dex had been documenting: individual recognition, schedule tracking, reciprocal deposits, camera awareness and adjustment were not new observations. They were Phase 3 indicators, behavior that the program had documented in previous cycles at the same locations. The current program had been designed knowing these behaviors would emerge. The Stage 3 notation on the laminated card had not been a protocol designation for their current feeding configuration. It was a classification for where the animal population currently sat on a behavior continuum that the program had been mapping across nearly 2 decades. The program knew exactly what these animals were capable of. It had known since before Dex was hired. What the program was doing, what it had been doing for 18 years by the time Dex came on, was not studying whether the animals could develop these behaviors. It was managing the pace at which those behaviors were expressed in proximity to the contractor teams. The stage designations were not feeding protocol categories, they were relationship stages. The program was not studying an unknown animal, it was managing an ongoing contact protocol with a population of beings that had been engaging with human infrastructure in that corridor for a very long time. And the feeding stations were not bait or conditioning tools. They were the program's contribution to an exchange that the animals had been participating in on their own terms, for longer than any of the contractor teams had been there. Dex read the phase analysis reports over 2 days. He read about Stage 1, which covered the initial establishment of stations in areas with documented prior activity. The program did not choose random locations, it chose locations where the animals were already present. He read about Stage 2, which covered the first habituation period, when visitation became predictable and individual animals were identified through track and camera analysis. He read about Stage 3, which covered behavioral escalation, the animals' increasing engagement with the station infrastructure, including the camera adjustments and reciprocal deposits that Dex had documented. And at the end of the most recent phase analysis report, in a section dated about 5 months before the current date, he read the notation that stopped him. Stage 4, assessment pending. Entry criteria not yet met. Criteria: sustained direct observation, contractor initiated without animal departure response. Estimated timeline, 12 to 18 months. Stage 4 was not defined beyond the entry criteria. The report noted only that Stage 4 protocols would be distributed separately to cleared personnel upon criteria confirmation. Dex read that notation twice, then he read it again. Then he sat back and thought about what it meant to have an undefined next stage that required a contractor to maintain sustained direct observation of an 8-foot bipedal animal, without the animal choosing to leave. He had been in the program for almost 3 years. He had signed on to service feeding stations in a wildlife study. He was now reading a behavior management protocol that had been running for nearly 2 decades, designed with stages and criteria, and classified next phase documents that nobody had told him existed, and the next stage required him, or someone on the team, to be in a position where one of these animals could have chosen to leave but had decided not to. He requested a meeting with the program coordinator, not through Oren, directly. The request went through the contractor firm's internal channel and came back 48 hours later with a scheduled call time. Dex prepared notes. He laid out his observations about the camera adjustment, the individual recognition at Station 7, the reciprocal deposits at Station 10, and his reading of the Stage 4 criteria. He asked the coordinator to explain the full program objective. He asked what Stage 4 looked like and what Stage 5, if there was one, was designed to produce. He asked who the federal client was by name and what the program's authorized purpose was under federal wildlife management law. The coordinator, a man Dex had spoken to only by phone across 3 years of assignment and whose last name he was never given, answered these questions carefully. He confirmed that the program had federal authorization under land management provisions that he declined to specify. He confirmed that previous program phases had documented the full range of behaviors Dex had read in the reports. He declined to describe Stage 4 protocols on an unencrypted line. He said that Dex's performance had been exemplary and that his continued role in the program was valued. He said the program was operating within its authorized parameters. He said the feeding station served a legitimate resource management function. He said that what Dex had characterized as an exchange at Station 10 was a behavior pattern that the program had documented and was managing appropriately. Then he said something that Dex told me he has turned over in his mind more times than he can count in the years since. He said, "The animals understand the stations as a reciprocal arrangement. That understanding is consistent with the program's objectives." Dex left the program 4 months later. He cited a family circumstance which was true enough. His marriage was under serious strain from years of rotating in and out of remote work on a contract that he could not describe to his wife in any meaningful detail. He submitted his termination paperwork through the firm, signed the exit documentation including an updated NDA with additional provisions he read carefully before signing, and drove out of the Cherokee for the last time on a cold morning in December. He kept the personal log. He kept the copies of the phase analysis reports that Oren had forwarded him, which technically fell under the NDA but which Dex had made a calculated decision about after consulting the attorney years later. He kept the personal copies of the station camera footage he had archived during the program, including the Station 7 footage of the hand on the camera and the Station 8 footage of the camera adjustment. He kept these things not because he had a plan for them, but because he understood instinctively that physical documentation of what had occurred was the only thing that separated his account from a story that nobody had any reason to believe. His wife, Sherry, had largely stopped asking him questions about the work by the time he left the program. There had been a period in the middle years, around the 3rd year, when the questions had been specific and had been met with answers that were technically true but deliberately uninformative. And after long enough of that dynamic, she had developed a quietness around the subject that was worse than the questions. When he left the program and came home full-time, the quietness did not go away immediately. It had become a permanent feature of certain parts of their communication, a territory that had been marked off and was not revisited. He told me they still had a good marriage. He said it with the careful, specific honesty of someone who has thought seriously about what good means in that context. The things the program did to his relationship were not dramatic. They were the slow kind, the kind that comes from years of carrying something you cannot share with the person closest to you and watching the gap it creates get a little wider every month until one day you realize the gap is just part of the geography, and you navigate around it like any other feature of the terrain. He stopped hunting after leaving the program. He had hunted whitetail in these mountains his entire adult life, the same ridges his father and grandfather had hunted, the kind of seasonal ritual that men in the mountain counties of eastern Tennessee consider as defining as anything else in their identity. He put his rifles in the back of the gun safe and has not taken them out for deer season in close to 15 years. He told me he does not entirely understand why, that he has tried to examine the connection and it is not as simple as he expected it to be. He said it was not fear of the mountains. He went back to Carter County often, still walked those ridges, still knew the terrain better than most. It was something more specific. A sense that the relationship between the hunter and the hunted had been complicated in ways he had not chosen. That the mountains he had grown up hunting were not the mountains he understood them to be, and that the activity of moving through that terrain with a weapon and a tag in his pocket felt different now. Not morally straightforward in the way it always had been. Not a simple and honorable engagement with the natural order, but something more ambiguous, something that required a renegotiation he had not yet completed. He said this slowly and with some embarrassment, the way men of his generation and background sometimes say things that their upbringing did not give them language for. He was not afraid of the deer. He was not afraid of the woods. He was uncomfortable with the idea of moving through terrain that something else considered its own, with a weapon, without any acknowledgement of that fact. He said it was the protocol that had done it to him. not the encounters. The protocol, understanding that somebody had been managing a relationship between humans and these animals for 20 years. That there were stage designations and entry criteria and classified next phase documents, and that none of it had been discussed with the people whose lives were most directly implicated. The people living in the counties and hollows that bordered this corridor, the hunters and hikers and kayakers on the Watauga, the farmers whose property backed up against the national forest. None of them had been consulted or informed or given any framework for what was operating in the mountains they used every day. The program had made a decision on their behalf, and the decision was silence. Orrin died of a cardiac event in 2015. Dex went to the memorial service in Texas, drove 3 days each way to pay his respects to a man he had worked closely with for nearly 3 years and spoken to irregularly in the years after. He was the only person at the service from the program. The contractor firm that had employed them both had by then been absorbed into a larger firm through an acquisition that Dex had learned about secondhand. He did not know if the program continued. He did not know if the same stations were still being serviced. He drove back to Tennessee and sat on his porch and looked at the ridge above his house for a long time. The mountain line he could see from that porch was 20 miles from the corridor. He still thought about it. There are things Dex told me that I want to present carefully and honestly. He is not certain the program was malicious. He is not certain the creatures were harmed by it. He is not certain that the Stage 4 and Stage 5 protocols, whatever they contained, were designed with bad intent toward either the animals or the human population in the area. What he is certain of is that the program was designed and operated with a level of knowledge about these animals that the public does not have access to, and that this knowledge was treated as the property of a federal program rather than as information that the people most directly affected by it had any right to know. He is certain that something in those mountains has been aware of human beings as specific individuals, has been incorporating human behavior patterns into its own movement and decision-making, and has been doing so across multiple generations of humans who came and went on rotation while the animals remained in the same territory. He is certain that the notion that DOGMAN sightings are isolated events, individual animals blundering into contact with startled humans in random patches of wilderness, is not consistent with what the program documented. The activity in the Cherokee Corridor was organized, territorial in the deep sense, meaning the animals had a relationship with the land that had continuity across decades. The feeding stations did not create that relationship. The program's own phase analysis reports made clear that the stations were placed in locations of prior documented activity. The program came to something that was already there. The question that has kept Dex awake, the question he cannot fully resolve, is whether the program understood what it was coming to and managed it competently, or whether the program understood what it was coming to and managed it in a way that served an institutional interest rather than a public one. The program documentation Dex retained describes a population of animals in the Cherokee Corridor, a DOGMAN population, though the program never used that word, that was assessed at a minimum of 6 individuals across the active study area. That assessment was based on track analysis and camera data from a specific 2-year window in the early 2000s. The actual population size was noted as uncertain in both directions. There may have been fewer if some individuals ranged across the corridor boundary on seasonal cycles. There may have been more if non-assessed individuals existed in adjacent terrain that the station grid did not cover. The Cherokee National Forest in that region borders the Pisgah National Forest across the state line in North Carolina, and the terrain between the two is contiguous wilderness. There are no fences. The Unaka Ridgeline is not a boundary that a large animal with detailed knowledge of the terrain would treat as a limit. What the program was documenting in its station grid was not a closed population. It was a cross-section of something larger. Linda Godfrey spent 31 years documenting DOGMAN encounters across the upper Midwest and came to nearly 600 accounts that she considered credible by any reasonable investigative standard. Godfrey's data came from witness testimony. People who had encounters and reported them voluntarily after summoning the considerable courage it takes to tell a story that most people will receive with skepticism or ridicule. Her documentation represents the visible surface of a phenomenon that is much larger beneath it, because for every person who reports an encounter, there are many others who do not, who carry what they saw in silence because the professional and social cost of talking about it is too high. The Cherokee Corridor program suggests that what Godfrey's witnesses were encountering across Wisconsin and Michigan and the broader Lake Country was not anomalous. It was not random contact with stray individuals blundering through human-occupied terrain. It was the edge of an ongoing relationship between a territorial intelligence and the human population that occupied the same landscape, and that relationship had its own history, its own patterns, its own logic that had been operating long before any program came along to document it. Steve Cook's song reached over 500 people who called a northern Michigan radio station in 1987 to report that what the song described had happened to them. Those 500 people had been carrying their DOGMAN encounters in silence. What broke the silence was not proof. What broke it was the simple fact that someone had spoken first, that the story had been named out loud. The responses that flooded in were not manufactured. They were not the product of suggestion from the song's details, because the details in Cook's lyrics were general, and the accounts that called in were specific, precise, and varied in ways that consistent fabrication would not produce. What Cook accidentally provided was permission, the permission to say, "This happened to me too." Dex is providing something similar, not proof in the sense that will satisfy a skeptic. His program documentation is specific enough to be verified in its broad strokes by anyone willing to cross-reference federal contracting records, land management archives, and the personnel databases of the contractor firm. But the core of it is not publicly accessible and was designed not to be. What he is providing is a different kind of evidence. He is describing a program that assumed the existence of these animals as its operational premise. It did not investigate whether they existed. It managed a relationship with them that had already been established by prior program phases. The existence was not in question. Only the management was. For the people who live in Carter County and Johnson County and along the Watauga River drainage between Elizabethton and the National Forest boundary, the question that Dex's account raises is not whether something unusual inhabits the remote hollows above the river. The people who have spent their lives in that terrain, who run cattle on its lower slopes and hunt its ridges in November, who kayak the Watauga's lower section in summer and run the logging roads in fall looking for sign. Many of them already know the answer to that question at some level, in the way that people who spend enough time in a piece of ground develop an understanding of what belongs there that cannot always be articulated but that accumulates across years of observation. What Dex's account raises for those people is the second question, not whether, but who knew, and for how long, and what was done with that knowledge, and whether any of it was ever going to reach them. The answer to that last question, as best Dex can determine, is that the program never had a public disclosure component. There is no record in the documentation he retained of a planned release of findings to any public or scientific body. There is no indication that the federal client, whoever they were, whichever agency's authorization covered the program, ever intended the accumulated data to enter any accessible record. The phase analysis reports were internal documents. The stage designations were internal classifications. The knowledge that a population of large bipedal canids had been assessed, studied, habituated, and engaged in a structured contact protocol across nearly 20 years of continuous federal program operation was, as far as Dex could determine, known to exactly the number of people who had a direct operational role in the program. And those people, including Dex, had signed non-disclosure agreements with teeth. He is talking now because the calculus has changed. Because Oren is gone and the firm is gone and the program, as far as he can determine, has not been active in its original form for over a decade. Because his attorney confirmed that the specific NDA provisions are unenforceable as applied to information demonstrating that a federal program operated outside its authorized scope. And some of what the phase analysis reports describe, specifically the Stage 4 entry criteria and the undefined Stage 5, sits in an area where the authorization chain is not clear. Because he is in his early 60s and the window for this testimony to have any impact on how people understand the phenomenon is not infinite, and because what he saw at that station camera, what he sat with for 20 years, is something that the people who spend time in those mountains deserve to know. The Cherokee understood this for centuries. Knowledge of what shares your landscape is not a burden. It is a protection. Because the respect that the Cherokee Protocol extended to these animals, the ancient protocol, the one that predated any federal program by 1,000 years, was built on knowledge. The program's disclosure, if it ever came, would need to serve the same purpose. Not to frighten the people who live in those mountains, not to push them off land their families have occupied for generations, but to give them the same foundation the Cherokee always had, on the understanding that something else had a claim to this landscape. That coexistence required acknowledgement, that moving through that terrain without understanding what also moved through it was not neutral. It was a deficit. Dex still walks the ridges above the Watauga when the weather is right. He still knows every drainage, every hollow, every creek crossing between Elizabethton and the National Forest line. He drives his truck up the old logging roads in the fall, parks where the road ends, and sits in the cab for a while looking at the tree line. He told me he has not heard anything unusual in those mountains since leaving the program. But that is not quite the same as saying nothing is there. He said the forest has a quality to it in certain places and at certain hours, that he cannot describe precisely, but that he has not been able to attribute to any known cause. A quality of attention, a sense that the terrain is not empty in the way that terrain without observers is empty, that the observation is not only going one direction. He has felt this since he was a child walking these ridges with his father before he understood what it might mean. The program gave him a framework for understanding it that he did not ask for and would not have chosen. But he could not unknow what the stage assessments told him, could not walk back into those hollows as though the phase analysis reports did not exist. He knows what was documented there. He knows what the stage criteria measured, and he knows that the corridor between the Watauga drainage and the upper Nolichucky country is not empty of the things the program was studying. They were there before the program. They will be there after whatever comes next. The terrain belongs to them in a way that no federal authorization document can grant or revoke. The program did not create that arrangement. It only named it. And naming it, documenting it, running stage assessments and phase analysis reports and feeding stations resupplied on a rotation. All of that was a human attempt to formalize a relationship that the animals on the other side of it had been managing on their own terms for a very long time. What the program never figured out, what the Stage 4 criteria and the undefined Stage 5 suggest were still unresolved when the contract ended, was whether what they were building toward was something the animals had already decided. Whether the sustained direct observation without departure response that Stage 4 required was not an achievement the program was working toward, but a permission the animals were deciding whether to extend. Whether in the 17 years of feeding stations and phase analysis reports and stage designations, the program had been trying to reach a threshold that the animals had been measuring from their own side for just as long. Dex thinks about that sometimes, sitting in his truck at the end of a logging road. He thinks about the creature that adjusted the camera on Pond Mountain, the long-fingered hand reaching up in thermal footage to redirect a lens toward his approach path. He thinks about the deposits at Station 10, the clean deer leg placed with the hoof oriented toward the forest. He thinks about the taller of the two figures at Station 7, watching him load his truck in the last gray light of evening, and then turning its head away with the unhurried deliberateness of something that had seen what it came to see. And he thinks about a line from the phase analysis report summary that he has read more times than he can count. It was in the behavioral assessment section, written by a program coordinator whose name he was never given. It read, "Subject population demonstrates consistent awareness of study personnel as individuals. Behavioral adaptation to specific personnel is documented across multiple encounters and appears to persist across intervals of weeks or months. This suggests working memory capacity and individual recognition capability consistent with higher-order social intelligence. Population does not appear to be habituating to the program. Program may be habituating to the population. He does not know if Stage 5 was ever defined. He does not know what it would have required. He knows only what the Cherokee country looked like on a cold December morning when he drove out of it for the last time. The forest holding its silence on both sides of the road, and the ridge above the Watauga carrying its own weight of knowledge across a sky that had just started to lighten in the east. The mountains looked the same as they had always looked. That was the thing about them. Whatever the program had documented, whatever the stage assessments had measured, the mountains held it in the usual way. Without announcement, without disclosure, with the long patience of terrain that has outlasted every human arrangement ever made within it and expects to outlast the next one too.